Well, it's my pleasure to kick off proceedings by introducing Professor Brian Schmidt, who, to most of you, I think, doesn't need much of an introduction. He is Nobel Laureate in Physics, 2011, Vice-Chancellor of the Australian National University. We were just talking a little bit about the peculiarities of university politics. But today he's really going to tell you about his experience of dealing with politicians, of getting science messages across to politicians, and through that, directly or indirectly, influencing science policy. Brian has indicated he's going to speak for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then he's going to open the floor for questions or comments that can be commented upon, I guess. So will you please join me in welcoming Professor Brian Schmidt.
Thanks, Jim. I think in the spirit of what Katrina said, we'll start off with a selfie which we can post on Twitter. So I'm sure you all look great. Excellent. So I have been involved with Science Meets Parliament since its first year. The first year of Science Meets Parliament was when I was a young postdoc. I had not yet discovered the accelerating universe, and I got to go out and meet some MPs, just like you're going to be doing as part of this. We didn't get quite as much professional training back then, but it was an interesting experience, and I did it for 3 years. And your experience will vary. I met my first year someone who really had no idea what was going on, why I was in their office, was confused that a scientist had been left in their office. And then I met someone else who was very nice and very interesting. In my second year, I didn't even get into the office of the person I was met to meet. The conversation went like this. I was on the MP speakerphone where you call up their office, and I said, "Hello, I'm Brian Schmidt. I'm here to be part of Science Meets Parliament." And the receptionist yelled to the person, "Oh, that scientist person is here." And I hear, "I don't want to meet," and then I hear, "Excuse me, the member of parliament is not available right now." And that was the end of Science Meets Parliament number 2 for me. Number 3 was much better. The good news is, by being persistent, this is now a regular part of what the parliamentarians expect in their year. They know who you are, what you're doing. But that is a metaphor for your own experience with parliamentarians. You don't change the world in day one. You do it bit by bit by bit, year after year after year. We show members of parliament what science is. We connect them with scientists, and they realize why we exist and what we do. Ultimately, parliamentarians are people. Sometimes they feel inhuman. That's typically only the ones who have been in parliament for more than 10 years. When they start, they are just like you, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, and not at all cynical. So if you are lucky enough to have a first-termer, then you will see this great enthusiasm. If you get someone who you know who's been in there for 15 years, then you have a battle-hardened warrior who maybe is a little more cynical than you are. So you just have to understand, though, that they are people and they react to conversations just like you do. And you have to treat them that way, and that's what they want to know. They want to know about you. You need to have a narrative, and they're going to help you develop that. And that narrative is who you are, why you became a scientist, what you're doing, why is it interesting. Now, you need to have a narrative of what and why what you are working is interesting. Don't be shy about saying it's intrinsically interesting. For example, when I was trying to explain that I was measuring the past of the universe, the conversation is, "That's interesting. Why do we care?" And I'm like, "Well, I'm prepared to say it is intrinsically interesting, isn't it? And talk them through why it's intrinsically interesting. But then also be prepared to say, now you may be wondering why Australia is investing in this. And that's a conversation I'm also prepared to say is, yes, it is interesting, and it has a benefit in my case of people actually engaging with science and mathematics for the first time through their interactions with astronomy, for example. And astronomy has gone on and develops lots of interesting people and talent and technologies. And then giving specific examples of things related to what you do is very useful for politicians as part of that narrative. Don't dwell on it, just as a little drop in. And, by the way, we invented Wi-Fi along the way, and just keep going, right? It only needs 3 seconds in there. But it's important to put some context in what you're talking, because they do care about that. But on the other hand, don't sell short the intrinsic interest of what you do. It is really important not to talk about money or funding directly. That is not your job here today. That is to be done in a very different context. We want this event to be interesting and enjoyable for them. Whinging, we don't get enough money, that's not what today's about. Trust me, you'll have plenty of chance to do that in a very different forum later on. You want to keep things positive. It is okay to talk about what matters to you, things that are important to you. For example, if you use the synchrotron, you say, I really get a lot of value out of the synchrotron. If you use telescopes like I do, the investment in the Giant Magellan Telescope, I'm really appreciative of the government doing that, because that's really going to allow me to be competitive. That's positive things. Saying the cut you did last year in blah, blah, blah doesn't gain you anything. It just makes them switch off and they go into defensive mode, and you won't get anything. You really do win typically by keeping it positive, unless there is a very large concerted strategy that goes across the entire sector. Which may involve your pay grade at some point, but does not today. You might want to think of, in your area, what are the strengths? Why is Australia doing this? Is it interesting? Does Australia have specific advantages that we're doing it? Talk about the expertise. Are we world leading? If you've come here from some other part of the world, why did you come to Australia? When you're meeting politicians, you should avoid assuming anything. The lowly backbencher today may be PM tomorrow. The person you're meeting from the Green Party may hate their fellow Green members and like members of the Liberal Party, and vice versa. I promise you, if they hate anyone, it will be a person from their own party. You need to remember that. They may loathe the other side of politics, but they truly hate each other. And so you should not assume anything, okay? Do not believe that current policy as stated by the party they belong to is their own belief. They have no choice. They need to believe what the central party is. So don't focus in on what they're talking about. Rather, keep the focus on what you know, the science. Their advisors will be in the room with you. They matter. They're the ones who keep things going. They were the ones who are most likely going to be who you'll follow up conversations with. They have a lot more influence than you may realize. Much more so, quite frankly, than the politician themselves in most cases. Department members, of which we have a few around here, also matter. They're the ones who are going to be pushing information up through the bureaucracy into the political, into the politicians. You get change typically when you get a convergence between politician thinking something, their advisors thinking something, and the department thinking something. When they all agree, that's when you're likely to actually get things to move. So that they're all part of the audience. Sometimes things will get hard. They may ask you a question. I managed to set off a certain minister in his office last week, quite accidentally, but I did. So what do you do when that happens? Take a breath. Go slow. Don't ever, ever get defensive. Ever. Ever. Never get defensive. Do not let the minister or the member of parliament get defensive. Never put them in a position where there's defensiveness. If you find yourself in that position and they ask you a very hard, penetrating question and you don't have a reasonable answer, a good thing to do is to ask a question back. But what do you think about that? I'm not sure. That's a great way to stop anyone. If they make a statement which is categorically untrue, you know is wrong, you need to not say, well, sorry, that's wrong. What I like to do in these situations is say, well, that's one way to think about it. I like to think of it this way. Or other people have this view. But don't. Keep it positive. This is a technique I learned with Katrina on the phone the day I won the Nobel Prize, when I suddenly found myself talking to Andrew Bolt about climate change. And I managed to get through the entire interview in 5 minutes in a positive way, where I actually talked about climate change, and Andrew Bolt was happy at the end of the conversation. And I've learned that technique works every time. You kind of like skipping from rock to rock. Do not let the conversation settle to negativity. Hopefully you won't get into that situation, but those are very important little techniques that I have learned. It's also important to engage the politician what's important to them. Ask, what are the issues around science that you think are important in your district or to you personally? And they may well bring up something like, what was the tree? It was sycamore, that you know nothing about. But that's okay. What you do is say, oh, I have a lot of friends, so let me go back and check out on that piece of information. And then you can hand off the question to Katrina, and Katrina will use her extensive networks, and we can find an answer for that person. But you must follow up. When they ask you for a piece of information and you say, I'll do that, then try to follow up as fast as you can with a sensible answer by getting in connections to sensible people. In the end, you're here as part of a long-term relationship of science with parliamentarians. It may or may not involve you in the future, but it is a connection of what we are and what we do to what happens in the House. One final note is politicians will be finishing up their first term, a big long sitting, and they're going to be tired and cranky. It's a very hard place to work there. They're isolated from their families typically, and understand it's incredibly stressful. So think about being soothing and friendly and talk about opportunities and think about that context, that it's a positive experience for them, not one of just being assaulted like they have been for the previous 3 weeks. I'll stop there and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Well, there speaks the voice of experience, that's for sure. Just a whole lot of pearls of advice there. Now, we do have about 10 minutes for questions or comments, so please, any questions from the floor? There's a roving mic, by the way. Yes.
Just a question about political climate and science at the moment. It looks like the profile of science or the visibility in Parliament ebbs and flows with time. Can you comment on what you think it's like at the moment, and in particular with the potential election coming up?
So both the government, the opposition, the Greens, and even some of the crossbenchers believe that science and innovation is the key to future prosperity of this country. So that is square and center. Trying to make that translate to money is going to be a challenge, and that's not your job today. I think your job is to really be bringing home that not only is it a key to the future, we're already working on it, that science is doing these things. And as your narrative, as you talk about the great stuff you're doing, as I said, have a way to put it into context of how it's going to keep Australian great in the future. And I think that's a really important narrative, but it is it is the best it's ever been in my 21 years in Australia right now. But do not think that's going to translate to hundreds of billions of dollars in the next election. We can hope for hundreds of millions if we're lucky.
Good questions. Brian, can I ask you, when you first came to Science Meets Parliament, you were an early career researcher. When you came back as a Nobel laureate, what was different in the way you had to interact with politicians from that point of view? And I think I've heard you on other occasions say there's a bit of a sort of two sides to that coin as well. Responsibility.
Yeah, so, when I first, my first 3 times at Science Meets Parliament, I was just like you. I gained experience. I got to understand a little bit of the beast you're dealing with in Parliament. I hope I help enthuse those who actually met with me. When you win a Nobel Prize, your volume level goes up by probably about a factor of 1 million. And that is an incredible opportunity and responsibility. It also means that it's easy to step on a landmine whenever you do that. So I have to be pretty careful what I do and say now, because anything I do and say will end up on the paper, and it has the potential to cause problems as well as occasionally do good. I mean, the biggest thing I can do is cause problems. It's very easy for me to cause problems. Actually doing good is challenging. And so that experience helped me do that. It also provided a few relationships that go way back that were useful. But in the end, sometimes someone in this room, several of you, are going to suddenly land an opportunity. Someone in this room may well win a Nobel Prize in the future. I don't think we know who it is right now. I certainly did not know I was going to win a Nobel Prize when I was you, back in the late 1990s when this all started. But when you have that opportunity, you need to be prepared to take it and not cause destruction, but rather to have positivity. And so that's one of the things I think is really important here. But it's also this groundswell, this groundswell of it not just being people like me talking. It's actual real people who are young, who are enthusiastic, that make them feel good. And it's more valuable than you realize, just that connection. And it helps me when I talk to them actually have effect as well.
Further comment? Yes.
Hi, thanks for all the great piece of advice. I was just wondering, as a young researcher, I haven't finished my PhD yet. If you could meet yourself and you could give yourself, 1 or 2 pieces of advice with all your experience you have now, what would that be?
Patience is, you really just have to keep persisting in patience. And things don't always turn out well. But sometimes they do. And I promise you, by being positive, whether it's dealing with Parliament or your thesis, that's always the best thing to do. You remain positive, and you'll get the best possible outcome. It may not be what you want, but it'll be the best possible outcome. That's the best piece of advice I can give anyone.
Yes, right at the back.
My area is cybersecurity and cryptography, and I want to come back to the comments you made a while ago about trying to be effective without getting people's backup, which I would really appreciate more advice on. So on the one hand, cybersecurity, it's easy to say, well, cybersecurity is a good thing and we should have more of it, and that's obviously pretty uncontroversial. On the other hand, it touches on some very controversial issues like metadata retention or export controls and all kinds of things that are already hot button kinds of issues. So any guidance you can offer about how to touch on those kinds of issues in an effective way without getting people's backup would be most appreciated.
So unless you're a policy expert in metadata control or things, and even if you are, probably not the type of thing you want to talk about. What you want to talk about is I work on cryptography. It's fundamentally based in the mathematical sciences, and it allows us to do many things. For example, it underpins our banking system. It underpins national security, and you talk about those issues. Then they say, well, what is your view about metadata control? And then I think you say, very complex political issue. My job is really to provide the technical expertise so that politicians like you can do the right thing. Understand the difference between a scientific question and a political question, right? And you are an enabler of many, many good things, but sometimes technology does bring an ethical conversation. Same with stem cells. If you know, it's your and our job to allow humanity to move forward, but the ethics of how we interact with society is really a place where we meet with politicians and say, do you have any specific questions about the technology that I can answer? But don't try to take a side on the policy in this forum. Again, when we do that, I recommend doing it in a broad, concerted effort where you don't just end up as individuals giving different advice, which just ends up being static on the radio and doesn't move things forward, and it actually makes scientists look unreliable and not useful.
Brian, I'd like to pick up your comment about patience, and basically to ask, do you think the Australian people have patience? Do you think the Australian people have been inspired by the NISA announcements in December, or it's been 3 months, why hasn't the National Innovation and Science Agenda actually had an impact yet?
So the Australian people do not have patience. They respond, as we all do, like sheep to leadership. And I promise you, if we all go out here, most of us are going to sit in the same seat that we just sat in. We respond in very specific ways. But leadership does respond to patience. And that is what I think you need to interact with. So the patience, yeah, we keep investing and working with the Australian people, and I don't know about you, I do things like scientists in schools, and I keep investing in that because I think it's important. But I know my little bit of doing that is a little bit in a little tiny little piece in the cog, but I have patience because I think it's important. But today we're actually influencing leadership, and good quality leadership will persist for many, many years, and I think that gives you hope. What you don't want to have is leadership that suddenly is completely disengaged with science. So you're trying to shore up future people here who are going to be the future leadership. So hopefully they're engaged with science as well.
Thank you. A final question?
Thank you. So you broadened your advice about engaging with policymakers to general career advice about early career researchers staying positive. How do you recommend that we stay positive without minimising real concerns about both Australia's scientific future and also opportunities for young scientists?
Yeah. So again, when I talked about personal constraints, I think it is important when you're talking about the positive, we can do this and this. The big constraints that I have are the fact that NHMRC gives one-year grants, and that is a real problem. As a person in a young career, you can imagine every year you have to fight for your job. Those are constraints that are strategic constraints that keep you. Don't make it money. Talk about the constraints. Lack of certainty is a problem in the sector. We tend, things like that, I think are useful early career constraints that can help.
Look, we have run to the end of this time period. I'm sure you'll join me in thanking Brian for extremely insightful view.
Thank you and good luck.